Okay, everybody. Welcome to the in-between version. Oh yeah, Triad Church. Welcome to Triad Church. That's what I meant to say. Thanks, Gabe. Okay, what we're going to learn about today is the in-between version. Okay, it's the in-between time. All right, who remembers what Miss Dana talked about last week? What book of the Bible was that? You guys were all sleeping last week. Yes, Noah, do you remember? Not Ephesians, nope. This is the last book of the Old Testament. He's a prophet. Malachi it was. Well done. All right, he's waking up. Okay, last week we talked about Malachi. Who remembers a little bit about what Malachi was talking about? Do y'all remember? John David?
It was like
Okay. Anybody else remember a little bit? I'm not sure. Reagan? Kind of like a temple. Okay. We're getting there. We're getting somewhere. Do y'all remember, I'm not sure if Miss Dana talked about it, but there's a prophecy in Malachi that God says he's coming like a refiner's fire and a fuller's soap. He's going to clean us up. That's what he said. He's going to come and he's going to clean us up. But it was a prophecy that he used Malachi to talk about, that he's going to come, and he was talking about the prophecy of his son, Jesus, that he's going to come and he's going to get us cleaned up from the inside out. Okay? So Malachi is talking about what we need to do to get right with God. Then we jump all the way, the next book of our Bible. Can anybody tell me what it is? It's the first book of the New Testament. We started learning that song. Matthew it is. Yeah, the next book of our Bible is called Matthew. I will give you, I actually won't because I don't have any tokens on me, but I will give somebody 5 tokens if you can tell me how many years there are that elapse between the book of Malachi and the book of Matthew. Wow. There are a lot of you that want to shout at 5 tokens. All right. Nope, not quite that many. 2008's too many. Lou? We're going to let 3 people guess. If you know it for sure, keep your hand up. If you're just guessing, put your hand down. Lou, do you know? No? Okay. Let's try. Andrew. Oh, 427 was so close, but still not correct. Okay, there are 400 years that elapsed between when Malachi sends his message down that's like, hey people, you need to get your act right. Jesus is coming. To when Matthew starts writing his gospel that says, bam, Jesus is here. 400 years. That's a long time. Even longer than Pastor Bob's been alive. Not by a lot, but by some. Yeah, 400 years. Do y'all know when the first settlers showed up on the continent of of North America? About 450 years ago. That's when the first people showed up. Before that, all there were Native Americans here, and our country is a total of 450 years old. Now, Israel's a lot older than that, but there's this space, this dead space that nothing's written about, right? So you go, what happened? All of a sudden, Jesus is born. You guys remember the story, right, from Christmas? Y'all remember that? What happens? It's like all of a sudden, here's Mary and Joseph. They're going because the Romans are having some census. Y'all remember? They got to go back to Bethlehem. Y'all remember that from the Christmas story? Where'd the Romans come from? Last time we knew, the Persians were telling the Jews to go home after they took over from Babylon. Y'all remember that? The Persians were like, all right, Ezra and Nehemiah, y'all get out of here. Just go home. We don't want you here anymore. We're not sure why the Babylonians brought you here in the first place. Everybody, just go. Right? Now all of a sudden we're having Romans taking a census when Jesus is here, and there's some dude named Herod, and he's a jerk, right? Y'all remember that? He has all the babies killed. All right, so we go, how do we get here? That's what we're going to talk about today. 400 years is going to be roughly a 3-hour teaching. So you guys settle in. You're going to do great. We'll have an intermission for a 30-second break later. I'm just kidding. We're not going to talk that long. I'm going to try and give you all some highlights. Now, if y'all pay attention, you will know things at the end of today that your parents don't know, that some of your pastors don't know. All right? This is a history lesson. It's what we'll call extra biblical, as in some of it's written in the Bible a little bit, but mostly this is stuff we find from history. How many of you are in school? Show of hands. You're in school, some of you. How many of you are having to do school kind of from home? It's a little bit strange, right? So what you're about to learn right now, maybe some of your history teachers don't even know, which may also be your parents or your pastors. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is first we're going to do a little bit of recap, because I taught you guys a couple of different lessons that are going to be important for today. First, I said, I don't know, it's been a long time ago, maybe even last year, that there were 4 major steps that God used to prepare the world, not just the children of Israel, but to prepare the world for the spreading of the gospel after Jesus' death and resurrection. Okay? The first was through the Assyrians. Who remembers what the Assyrians did? Hey, Noah, you got your hand up fast. What'd they do? The Assyrians came in and they conquered the northern 10 tribes of Israel. Y'all remember that? They were bad. Peter, do you remember what they did? What did the Assyrians do? What were they known for? Hang on, John David. Oh yeah, when the Assyrians took over, when they won, when they conquered a people, what'd they do? Yeah, they went kablam. They didn't exactly say join our army or die. They said kablam. They were hateful. They were mean. They were nasty. What they did is they tore families apart, and they took people from here and they spread them over there, and they threw people over there, and they said, here, that's your new husband, that's your new wife, y'all are a family, and everybody went crazy. Okay? They were not nice people. They were, in fact, terrible, terrible people. These are the Assyrians. But what that did is it took a lot of the children of Judah, a lot of the Israelites, and it spread them around Asia Minor. Now, that's where the Samaritans come from. The Jews didn't like the Samaritans because they said they were mixed. They weren't pure blood Jews. But what happened was, now when the gospel starts to spread, great-grandchildren and great-great-great-grandchildren are remembering things that their great-grandmother told them about God, about Yahweh, the one true God. Right? And so what happens then is all of a sudden their history is being remembered. Second great thing that happened, I call these the horrible steps of prep. Okay, I coined that phrase, it's kind of cheesy, but what this is these are the steps that we can see God working in really terrible things to get ready for a really awesome thing. Okay, so the first terrible step was the Assyrians conquered the 10 northern tribes of Israel. They were bad and they got hauled off and we still don't know exactly where they are. We may be some of their ancestors, who knows? They got scattered all over everywhere. The second thing that happened was Babylon, and they haul the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, the southern kingdom, into captivity. What? I told you we'd have a 30-second break. Now we're ready for the next 2.5 hours of... Okay, so what was Babylon known for? I know some of you know this. Ella, what was Babylon known? When they conquered a people, what did they do?
I thought Babylon did separate the families, like poor and rich. They separated the rich people and the poor people, and made the poor people rich and made the rich people less.
Not exactly. They did separate rich and poor people, and they did things with just an elite group of people. Go ahead. That's right. So what they did, it wasn't just the rich people. They took the most beautiful things from the cultures that they conquered, right? They would come in, they would take the most beautiful of all the people. So the most handsome men, the strongest men, the ones that were going to be the best for their culture. They took the most beautiful paintings. I'll tell you this. If they came in and all of us painted a picture and they were looking over saying, okay, which one of these is the most beautiful picture? Mine would be the last thing going to Babylon. I'm not a good painter, okay? All of your paintings would be better than mine. Babylon came in and they took all the nice stuff and they took it back to Babylon. Now what that did, one of the horrible steps of prep that I like to call them, the reason that was important is because it actually protected a portion of God's people. There were 2 guys that came back and they built a wall in a song we like to sing about. What were their names? Anybody remember? Yeah, Blue. What were their names? It says they built a wall around the neighborhood. Remember that from the song? One of them's name was Ezra. What was the other one? Nehemiah. Yep, Ezra and Nehemiah. They were the ones that after Babylon had fallen, the kings of Persia come in and they say, okay, everybody, you can go home. Get out of here. But what that did is it protected those people that were there. For 70 years they were in Babylon and they were protected. It was not very fun to be hauled into captivity. Some of them, if y'all remember Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they got thrown into lions' dens and fires, right? They weren't often super well treated, but they were protected, and God had a plan for that. Now we get to the fun part, the part we didn't learn about in the Bible. This is what we're talking about today. What's the next steps? I told you way back when, I don't expect for any of you to remember, that there were actually four big steps. We only learned about 2 of them in the Old Testament. The third step has to do with the Greeks. Who knows where the Greek people are from? What country are they from? Reagan, what country are they from? Nope, not Habakkuk. Greece. They're from Greece, which is a country in the Mediterranean. Picture this. If this right here is Israel, where my hand is Israel, okay? It's on the Mediterranean Sea, right? Up here is Greece, on the same sea, all right? Basically neighbors. It'd be like going from here to Maine, but still, it's close. They're on this. They share a similar border. All right, Greece has this thing about 70 years after Malachi writes his prophecy. There's this guy. We'll call him Alex, but his full title is Alexander the Great. You may want to remember that. It might be worth something later. This guy is a Greek general. He's the king of Greece. And his name's Alexander the Great, and he comes raiding down, and he takes over from the Persians. Okay, he beats the Persians, beats them bad. He actually dies while he's doing it, but he beats their armies and sets up this massive kingdom known as Greece. Now, the Greeks like to do this thing. The Greeks were very, very arrogant. You'll learn about that later. Paul's going to write a little bit about it. But the Greeks were very arrogant. They were very, very smart people. Okay? Kind of like some of you, kind of not like me, but they were very smart and they were very arrogant. What they like to do is they like to say, any country that we're going into, we're going to make them like the Greeks. It's a term. This term will be worth tokens later. It's called Hellenization. It doesn't have anything to do with hell directly, but Hellenization, actually Helle, H-E-L-L-E, is what the Greeks called Greece. That's the country they were from in ancient Greek, Helle. So Hellenization is actually the process of making people like the Greeks. Imagine this. Imagine I come over to your house and I say, okay, all you boys have to grow out long hair. Does that sound fun to any of you? You're all like, no, we don't really want to grow out long hair. And I'm like, okay, you got to do it because you got to be like me. That's not very nice. Right? The Greeks, when they showed up, they said, everybody, you got to stop what you're doing. Stop worshiping your gods. Start worshiping our gods. And they had a lot of them, an awful lot. So they show up in Israel, and they start tearing stuff apart. They start saying, hey, Ezra, Nehemiah, those guys were dead already, but their descendants, you don't get to practice your law anymore. You got to follow our laws. Not only that, you don't get to follow your rituals, like circumcision, which happened to every young Jewish boy. You don't get to do that anymore. You got to be like us, be like the Greeks. We're superior. All right? Now, this process of Hellenization, what that did is they said everybody has to speak the same language. If y'all look around this room right now, how many people in here speak a different language? We all speak English. How many of you guys, if I asked you to raise your hand, how many of you know another language besides English? What language do you know? A little bit of Italian? A little Spanish? What language do you know? Spanish, awesome. Dutch, fantastic. Spanish, nice. So I know a little bit of sarcasm. Does that count? It's sort of the same. I know a little bit of smart aleck. Actually, I'm pretty fluent in that. All right, so the Greeks, when they showed up, they said everybody's got to learn the same language. So let's say everybody in here has to learn Swahili. It's a very common language spoken in the south of Africa. So if I said to you, hey, all right, everybody in here, you got to stop speaking English and you got to start speaking Swahili. Does that sound fun to you guys? It might be interesting. I don't know. I don't know any Swahili off the top of my head, but it could be interesting. But what the Greeks did, came in and they said, you got to stop speaking your language and you got to start speaking ours. And everybody said, we don't want to. And they said, well, you have to or we'll kill you. But before we kill you, we'll kill your family in front of you. Does that sound fun? So all of a sudden we all start speaking Swahili. We're like, cool, we're motivated now. So what the Greeks did is they come in and they do this thing called, what was it? Hellenization. Great job, John David. They did Hellenization, which is where they make everybody like the Greeks. And everybody starts speaking the same language. This is the third step of the massive spread of the gospel. What I like to call the horrible steps of prep, okay? This is God using bad things that happen in the world. Romans 8:28 that we'll learn about later says, God uses all things to work together for the good of them that love him and have been called according to his purposes. This is God working in areas that we don't see and we sure don't deserve to prep us here in America 2,500 years later to be followers of Jesus. And that is the Greeks come in and they establish a common language. So first, people get spread out. Second, people get protected. Third, the Greeks come in and make it where everybody can speak the same language. Well, now imagine this. Imagine if everybody speaks the same language, we can now start speaking to each other, right? Now, all of a sudden, it becomes possible for Paul and Peter and the apostles to start spreading the good news because everybody's speaking the same language. We don't have to wait for a translation, right? So the Greeks show up and they're horrible. Honestly, they're really terrible oppressors. And they did not mind to kill people. And so what happens is they go into the temple. Who remembers what the temple's for? What's the really important function of the temple? Yes. Okay, it's where people will go to prayer, but there's a really important thing that happens in the temple. A vitally important thing. Sacrifices does happen, but it's where two things meet. What meets in the temple, Ella? It's where God comes down to meet with us. All right? That's what happened in the Old Testament temple. It's where God put his presence down into a place where the high priest could go in and could commune with him, right? Where does that happen now? Out of curiosity. Does anybody know? Where's the temple now? Where's it located? The temple is? Is it? Peter, where's the temple? It's inside of us, right? We are the temple of God now. But in the Old Testament, the actual temple, the physical temple, is where God would come down and meet with us. Guess what the Greeks did when they showed up? They said, we don't care about your God. We're going to put a statue of a guy named Zeus. Bolts or something. We're going to put a statue of Zeus on top of the altar inside the Holy of Holies. And they desecrated the temple. They came in and they said, we don't care about your God. In fact, we insist that you not worship your God and you worship our gods. And we're going to put Zeus right here just to mock you. And they would take pigs into the temple and they would cut them open and just let them bleed all over everywhere just out of disrespect. Well, they kept doing this, not just in the temple, but they did it all over everywhere. In all of the little towns, they would go in and they would kill people if you sacrificed to God. They also went around burning Bibles. They didn't call them Bibles back then, they called them the Torah, but they would go in and they would burn all the scrolls. How many of you in here have a Bible that you read? By show of hands. So the Greeks, when they showed up, what they would do is they would come into your house, and if your parents were reading you the Bible, they would kill your whole family. Yep, everybody in the family would be killed if you were reading the Bible. Then they would burn those Bibles, and they would put a big tax on all your neighbors. Well, they had to pay them a lot of money. It was terrible. So all of a sudden, in walks this guy. Actually, doesn't in walk here. He comes into our story. He's an old fella. Nearly 60, so way, way old. And his name is Mattathias. Now, I'm about to give you 6 names. You're going to want to remember all 6 of them, okay? These are about to be the 6 guys that are referred to as the Maccabees. Now, Maccabee is a Hebrew word for hammer. All right? The Maccabees, Maccabee wasn't their last name. It wasn't like their names were John, Jacob, Maccabee. No. Maccabee was a title, and it was given to them because they were firm, and they were hard hitters. All right? Maccabee has only been referred to by one other person in the history of Israel that was called Maccabee, and his name was Gideon. Y'all remember Gideon From back, he was one of the judges. He had a fleece that he turned over. No matter. He was also referred to as Maccabee. That's where the title came from, but it means the hammer. And Mattathias is the oldest guy. He's the dad. All right? So here we go. Daddy Mattathias. He's the big Maccabee, or the Big Mac, if you will. Yeah, but not from McDonald's. Don't worry. This is about 2,500 years before Big Macs actually got invented. But this is Mr. Maccabee. His name's Mattathias, and he's a rabbi. Who knows what a rabbi is? Yes, Claire, what's a rabbi? He's a Jewish priest, that's right. They're a teacher, right? If we lived 2,000 years ago, Pastor Dan would be referred to as Rabbi Balsam. That's because his last name's Bossum, and Balsam sounds more Hebrew. So Rabbi Bossum would be his name. If we lived back 2,000 years ago, what do y'all think we'd call Pastor Bob? Rabbi Bob. Y'all want to start calling him that? We can start calling him Rabbi Bob. All right, so Mattathias is a rabbi, right? And what that means is he lives in a small little town, much smaller than Greensboro. He lives in a small little town, and the Greeks show up, and they say, Mattathias, you can't offer sacrifices anymore. In fact, if you offer sacrifices, and if you read the Bible, we're going to kill you, and we're going to kill your 5 sons. Mattathias has 5 sons. Y'all ready for their names? John, he's the oldest, okay? John's a family man. He loves his wife. He loves his kids. He's kind of simple. All he wants to do is just plow the fields. He wants to live in peace. His name's John. Next is a guy named Simon. All right? Simon, he's kind of always at odds with his brother. He wants to be the oldest, but he's not. He wants to be the coolest, but he's not. He wants to be the one with a big family, but he's not. He wants to be the best priest, and he's not. He's just kind of an average fella. Simon lives the longest and rules the longest, and it's his family that ends up ruling Israel for over 120 years. All right? So Simon's the second one. So we got, who's the first one? John. Second one? Simon. Third one, his name is Judas. Now, Judas is actually the Greek version of the name Judah. So Judah and Judas, they're the same name. All right? So Judas is his name, and he's referred to as the epitome of a beautiful man. He was perfect. In fact, the Greeks, they loved the Olympics. They loved having people get together and all compete against each other in sports. They wanted Judas to become Greek so that he could compete for them in the Olympics. Right? Pretty cool. He was an amazing athlete, and he was an incredible leader. All right? So not only was he handsome, charismatic, that means he was really easy to talk to, he was really good at stuff, but he was a really incredible leader, and he was fearless. He was die. Always said, I'm ready to go. We do what's right. The fourth son, his name's all right? Eliezer, he's referred to as the splendor of battle. That was his title. His name was Eliezer, the splendor of battle. Eliezer, it seems like, for the most part, he may have had some slight mental disabilities. He loved his brothers and his dad more than anything in the world, and he'd do anything they asked him to do. His name was Eliezer, and he was a big guy, big, strong guy, and he fought with a big war hammer. I guess, I didn't have the exact measurements, but I'd guess his hammer was roughly the size of that speaker right there. Imagine him holding this, and that's a hammer that he's hitting things with. We'll get to a story in a minute about something he does with that hammer. It's pretty incredible. So Eliezer, his name's the splendor of battle is what he's called. And then the youngest son, Jonathan. When this story starts, Jonathan's about 14. All right? So he's not much older than you guys, and he's about to go to war with the Greeks. So Jonathan is fast. They said he was fast as a gazelle. Who knows what a gazelle is? What is it? It's like a... Correct. It's like a deer, but it's really fast. And they said that Jonathan could outrun a gazelle. I don't know if that's true or if it was a figure of speech, but either way, he was a fast fella. Yeah, he's got your name. So look, the oldest son is John and the youngest son's Jonathan. Mattathias ran out of imagination, but apparently his sons were pretty cool guys. So here's what Mattathias does. The Greeks come in and they say, hey, you got to stop sacrificing. Mattathias, once the Greeks leave, he says, hey, boys, we're not going to stop sacrificing. We fear God more than we fear men. See, sometimes in our lives, we hit this crossroad where we have to decide, are we going to obey God, obey His laws, or are we going to do what the people around us say is acceptable? Right? All of you guys may have already been faced with that, but you certainly will in your lifetime. And what you have, you'll have a decision very similar to Mattathias. And that is, are we going to do what keeps us out of trouble? Are we going to obey what has been told to us and keep us out of trouble? Or are we going to do what God says and risk maybe even being killed? Right? And Mattathias says, boys, we're not going to do this. We're not going to do what these people say. We're going to keep worshiping. And they were actually able to do that for almost 10 years. They were able to keep worshiping God because they were in a small little village out of the way. Now here's what happens, meanwhile, back in Jerusalem. The Greeks have taken over, right? Bad stuff is going on in the temple. Right? They've desecrated the temple. You can't offer sacrifices anymore. And they're turning the Jews into Greeks. Well, here's what happens. A lot of the people in Israel, they go, this is great. This is fantastic. We don't have to carry up to the temple anymore and give them to the high priest and him kill them. And we just do whatever we want. Not only that, there's this certain family in Israel. They were rich. They were Jews. They built a gymnasium. How many of y'all have ever been to a gym before? Yep. So this is the first time these had ever been invented was in Greece around this time, and it was so that they could train. A gymnasium is actually where they were trained to be warriors, but they would also train to play games. Right? They would train for the Olympics. Well, this Jewish family says, hey, let's build a gymnasium so that we can be like the Greeks. That was fine. It's not that big of a deal. The way the Greeks did it, when you were in the gymnasium, you had to be naked. So everybody, when they were in there training or fighting or whatever, the Greeks trained naked. And so what it became a place where you would go and show off that you were like the Greeks. So what happened is there was a divide. The Jews that wanted to keep worshiping God, they wouldn't go to the gymnasium, but the gymnasium was this point of focus. All right? It was this terrible spot where all this bad stuff happened. All right? So there's this group of Jews, and they're called the Hellenists. Basically, they became like the Greeks. They sold out. They betrayed their country, they betrayed their God, and they became like the Greeks, and the Jews hated them the most. They hated the Greeks. The Greeks were awful, but they really hated the Hellenizers. Okay? So all of a sudden, this one guy gets appointed. I don't know what his Jewish name was. He goes by Antioch, which is a common Greek name that they gave to a lot of people. And he decides he's going to get, yeah, Ben? They would sometimes, but that was later for Romans are the ones that trained to be gladiators. They would mostly train for games in the gymnasium. But what happens is this guy Antioch, he gets given power by the Greeks, and he says, here's what you got to go do. You got to go kill anybody that's still practicing the law around here. You got to go out to the little villages, and you got to go clean everybody up. Remember, this guy is a Jew. He should be following the law. Antioch takes and he heads on out, and he gets to the town of old Big Mac. What's his first name? Do y'all remember? Mattathias. Yep. They get to Mattathias' town, and Antioch comes in, and you know what he does? He kicks down the door of this house, and he goes in there, and he finds a scroll. They used to use scrolls instead of Bibles because they didn't have binding like we do. They just roll up paper. He finds a scroll in this house, and he brings the scroll and the 6-year-old daughter out of the house, and he burns them both in the street. And then, bad stuff starts happening. You can imagine, that did not go over very well. And all of a sudden, Mattathias comes out, and he grabs a sword, and he kills Antioch, and then he and his 5 sons kill the soldiers that were with him. So 6 of them against 20, they killed them all. And Mattathias buried the girl because he was the rabbi, and then they headed for the hills. Now what happens next is Mattathias gets referred to as Maccabee. He gets referred to as the hammer because he killed the Greek followers. And then starts a war. 20 years of war. How many of you in here are 20 years old? None of you. Madison, me, Pastor Bob. We're the only ones in here that are 20 years old. Imagine if a war started the day you were born, they'd still be fighting that war. That'd be awful. So 20 years worth of war where Mattathias, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar and Jonathan are all fighting against the Greeks. And they fight them, and they fight them, and they fight them. And in this one battle, I'm going to tell you all a story because I told you Eleazar and his hammer. There's a battle. They beat the Greeks 25 times. Now, they have an army of about 200 to 1,000 people. That's the biggest it ever got. The Greeks at one point, 32,000 soldiers in Israel trying to fight them. All right? That's a big number difference. And they beat that army. 1,000 to 32,000, they beat them. Killed almost every single one of them. This time, the Greeks hire mercenaries. They hire people from Africa to come up with elephants. And they bring elephants, and they've got the elephants on their trunks. They arm them with these big weapons. They got like spikes coming off of the trunks of the elephant so that they can go running through, swinging their head like this, and they can kill people with them. So the Jews, what they would do is they would get these valleys and they'd fill them up with rocks and stuff so that the soldiers couldn't get by, and then they'd attack them from the side. It was the common warfare that they used. It's how they beat the Greek soldiers. What these elephants did is they'd come in and they'd break those rocks apart. So all of a sudden, the elephants come storming in. There's 20 elephants, and they bust this rock wall apart, and they're killing a lot of the guys. And Judas, who was never afraid to die, and Eleazar, the third and second sons, Eleazar grabs his hammer, and he had these two guys that would follow him around. They were very loyal to him. They were his bodyguards, kind of. And they went running. They charged the elephants like this. Wah! And Eleazar jumps in the air with a hammer that big, wah! And he hits the lead elephant right in the head. Boom! He killed it. Yeah, way cooler than Thor. But he hit the biblical Thor. But he hit the lead elephant right in the head with his hammer. Bam! And the elephant collapsed, and the other elephants kind of piled up on top of it. And from there, Eleazar took his big hammer, and he killed 2 more elephants. With a hammer. Bam, bam. All right? Now, an elephant wouldn't be out of this room, but an elephant would be like probably taller than this. And huge. How many of y'all have ever seen an elephant in person at a zoo or something like that? Yeah, they're big. They're big. Yeah, bigger than the screen probably. Eleazar kills 3 of them with a hammer. And what happened was actually Judas, his brother, killed one of them with a spear. And when he killed it with the spear, it fell over on top of Eleazar, and that's how Eleazar died. So that was the first Maccabee that died, was the son in battle killing 3 elephants. How many of you guys know the Bossums? Do y'all know the Bossums? Patty and Lucy and John are usually in here. They have a brother, his name's Judah, and his name's Judah Eleazar. He's actually named after 2 of the brothers there that fought against those elephants. So now all of a sudden, Mattathias, whose son has just died, he's really sad. And he leads his sons, all the rest of them, they go in there to the camp of the elephants and all the mercenaries, and they kill them. They wipe them all out. But Mattathias also dies in that battle. So then what happens over the next about 20 years, actually that was about 15 years in, so over the next 15 years, they fight the Greeks and they slowly win their independence. Unfortunately, in that time, Simon dies. John, the oldest son dies. But they retake Jerusalem. And they go in there, and Judas spends a long time cleaning the temple, sanctifying it again, properly cleaning it as according to the law. And Judas becomes the first high priest since the Greeks had taken over. About 2 years later, Judas dies, and Jonathan, the youngest son, takes over as high priest. Who remembers what the high priest does? John David, what does the high priest do? That's right, he sacrifices. He's the one that actually meets with God face to face. He's the one that goes into the Holy of Holies, and he sacrifices the animals, but he makes atonement. He intercedes between God and the people. So Jonathan's now the new high priest. And there are only 2 brothers left. That's Simon and Jonathan. And Simon becomes they called him the king. He would never accept being a king because he said God needed to be the king of Israel. So he was called the Maccabee, and he was the ruler. He was the judge. And he had 4 children. And Jonathan ends up dying in the last battle with the Greeks before the Greeks were defeated. And so now all that's left is Simon. And Simon becomes both the high priest and the judge. He's the Maccabee. And what Simon does is he sets up a government that's independent. For the first time since the Assyrians attacked and hauled off the 10 tribes in the north, Israel's free again. And for 100 years, they enjoy freedom under the rule of the Maccabees. And these guys, most of the family died. Only one of them lived. He was married, and actually his wife died. But he had 4 children. And of those 4 children, each one of them, he had 3 sons and a daughter. Each one of them served as Maccabee, or served as judge at one point in their life, including the daughter. She was the ruler of Israel, actually, for the longest amount of time of his 4 children. And each one of his sons served as high priest. And then on down through, so that was in about 150 years before Jesus came to earth. Simon ended up defeating the Greeks and became high priest. For the next 100 years, his family ruled as the judges of Israel. And they were referred to as the kings of Israel, but only by the outside people that talked to them. In Israel, they knew there was no king. Now here's what happened. I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about it. I gave you the history of the family. I'm going to back up and talk a little bit about a spiritual history, okay? Because this becomes important for when we get into the New Testament here in just a couple weeks. When Judas gets into the temple, and he kills all the Jews, or not all the Jews, all the Greeks that are in Jerusalem, right? And he goes into the temple, and he cleans it up. He's scrubbing over here, and he's cleaning up pig's blood. He takes down remember I said they put a statue up of Zeus, that's right. He tore that thing down, threw it out in the garbage can where it was supposed to be. And he sets up this candlestick. It's called a menorah, and it's huge. I've actually seen it in Israel. It's bigger than my arms. It's probably about as wide as the TV screen, a candlestick. And it's actually 7 candles, okay? But it's huge, and it's made out of gold. And what they would do is they would pour oil in each of these little containers that sat on top of the candlestick, and they would burn them. And there's a tradition that's still recognized today. It's the holiday of Hanukkah that started after Judas cleaned out the temple. And he gets the menorah back out of wherever the Greeks had hidden it or stowed it away or tried to sell it or destroy it. And he sets it up and he pours the oil. They found one little keg of oil that was still sacred, that was still sealed up from before. The Greeks wouldn't let them make sacred oil anymore for burning in the temple. But they found one little bit. And they said it was enough for about 1 day. And so they poured it in each of the 7 candles and they lit them on fire so that it would burn. And it was a way of burning a sacrifice to the Lord and also as a way of making a memorial. And Judas said, we'll make this a holiday. We'll call it Remembrance Day. And that's what Hanukkah means, is it's a remembrance day. So what happens is they light this fire, and there was about enough oil for 1 day. It burned for 8 days straight. To this day, when the Jews celebrate Hanukkah, they celebrate it for 8 days because the Lord sustained that fire when there wasn't enough oil to keep it going. The Lord was the one that did that. Sometimes in our lives, we're running out of strength. We don't have enough to keep going, to sustain us. But God sustains us. So this happens after Judas cleans out the temple before he dies. Then what happens is they set up the law again. Right? I said Judas became the high priest, and then eventually once he dies, Jonathan became the high priest. But they set up going through the law again, following the sacrifices and all of that. Well, what happens is they get to a point of they got to decide whether to just be content with being able to go through their practices again, or whether to keep fighting the Greeks and try and take back their entire country. Right? And so it splits. There becomes this split in the religious people. And there are some of them that just want to keep recognizing the law, they're back to being able to worship religiously, and they're called Pharisees. And they're happy with that. They're happy with just let us worship in peace. We just want to be able to do this. They're the priests' families. And then there's this other faction that says, no, we want power. We want to take back our land from the Greeks. They're called Sadducees. Okay, both are religious leaders. One wants to have control of the temple, wants to have control of the spiritual processes that happen in Israel. The other says, yeah, we want control of the power of Israel. We want to take back our land. So there creates this split, a divide, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they don't like each other. And the Sadducees ended up going with the Maccabees and fighting the Greeks in the war. And the Pharisees stayed in Jerusalem and just developed more and more power. And you'll learn about them later in the Gospels when you get to the Pharisees and Sadducees. Both of them were greedy for power. And both of them wanted control of the Maccabees. They both wanted the Maccabees to agree with them, and the Maccabees wouldn't. They said, leave us alone. We don't care about your little two-party system. We don't care about you guys fighting who's in power. We want to rule Israel under God's leadership. And that's also really important for us to remember. There are always going to be people wanting to pull us certain directions. We've got to stay focused on God. Okay? So the Pharisees and Sadducees, this is where they get started. This is where they get their creation and where they start angling for power. All right? What happens after that is there's this guy who comes riding into town, and he's a Roman. All right? And he shows up and he says to Simon, Simon, this is about 70 years before Jesus shows up, 70. And he says, Simon, here's the thing, fella. Simon's an old man. He's about to die. His son's already high priest, and I think his daughter at that point was judge of Israel. He says, Simon, we need to make a deal. I need for you guys to be friends with Rome. Because this is incredible. What you got going on here, this is amazing. I've ridden all over the Roman Empire, which by this point has taken over the Greek Empire. They're huge. Rome's huge. So I've ridden all over the Roman Empire, and I've never seen a kingdom that runs like this one does. It's like you don't have a king. Everybody respects you. Your daughter's ruling. Your son's the priest. Everybody comes to you to bless their child. Everybody comes to you to ask you to marry their son or their daughter to perform the ceremony. This is an incredible country. How does it survive like this? You run off of, it seems like, love and respect, and you worship a God that can't see, but everybody seems very, very happy. I need for you to agree to be friends with Rome, because the last thing I want is for the Romans to have to come in and conquer you. If you'll just agree to pay Rome a certain amount of money, house some of our troops in spots you pick so that anybody that comes to attack you, we can defend you, we'll be very peaceful. And Simon says, I cannot do that because I made a promise to my father and my brothers that as long as we were alive, we wouldn't let outside rulers rule Israel. All right? And so Simon says, I can't make that deal. But here's the thing. I'm not the one in charge of Israel. If you'll talk to my daughter, she'll tell you yes. So what ends up happening is, though Simon couldn't do it himself because he'd made a promise to his father and brothers, the daughter of Simon making a deal with the Romans. Y'all remember the Romans, right? They're a big part of Jesus' story, right? They're kind of ruling Israel. That's how we got to this point, is because you get there and you're like, what in the world? Pilate's agreeing to have Jesus killed, right? This is how we got there, because the Romans came down and there wasn't a fight. The Maccabees agreed to let the Romans garrison some troops there and agreed to pay them a tax, and they were able to live in peace. Then what happens is, insert this one fella, and he's another mean fella. So for 150 years the Maccabees rule, and then all of a sudden there's a guy from Edom. I'll tell you his name in a second, but who remembers where or what Edom is? Anybody remember? We went over this back probably in Samuel and Kings. Anybody remember Edom? Who started the country of Edom? He was the brother of someone famous. Who started the country of Edom? Sort of God, I guess I don't want to say no. Y'all remember Esau? That old hairy fella that traded his birthright for a bowl of soup? Yeah, well, once he and Jacob got things straightened back out, he ended up on the east side of the Jordan River in a land called Edom. All right, we learned about Edom in several of the prophets. They were cursed most of the time. But all of a sudden, Edom's prospered over the last 150 years because the Maccabees are protecting them. Here comes this fella, and he's the king of Edom. His name is Herod. Herod the Great. And he decides he's going to take over. He wants to be king. He doesn't want to just be king of Edom. He wants to be king of Israel as well. And he goes on a war, and he defeats the Maccabees. And this is why this is important. Herod fights for 3 years against the Maccabees, but by this point, the Maccabees, they had pretty much already given up all control. They'd gone back to their little town. They'd pretty much disappeared. Herod defeats the Maccabees in a 3-year war, and he takes over as king, and he starts building palaces and stuff in Israel. And he decides he wants to fight the Romans, at which point the Romans beat him up a little bit and say, you can be king here, but we're going to be in charge. And they insert a guy named Pilate. That brings us up to about the point where Jesus is born. And we'll get to that in a couple of weeks. But I wanted to mention something about Herod that's important in our history before I close this out. And that is, y'all remember when the wise men show up and they say, hey, we're looking for the king of the Jews? He was born in a little town called Bethlehem. Y'all remember that from the Christmas story? And what does Herod do? He issues a decree and he says something has to happen. It was awful. Do y'all remember what it was? Noah, what was it? Aaron, what was it that Herod said had to happen? All the newborn babies had to be killed. Now here's the thing. Herod, he was scared. Because he didn't know where the king of Israel was supposed to come from. He hadn't read the prophets like you guys had to know that it wasn't going to be a military king that was coming in. He didn't know what we know. He was scared because he thought, gosh, maybe it's one of the Maccabees. Maybe one of them's having a kid that I don't know about. They've sort of just kind of disappeared. And I beat them up and took their land from them. You know, another reason why the Maccabees couldn't be kings, they wouldn't allow themselves to be kings, is because they weren't from the line of David. They were priests. And God said that the kings of Israel would be from the line of David. The king that lives forevermore would be from the line of David. And so Mattathias and Judas and Simon and all the rest of them said, we can't be king. We're not from the line of David. So Herod all of a sudden says, I've got 2 things that could wipe me out. One, what if this guy's that the wise men are here to see, what if he's one of the Maccabees, had a kid that I don't know about? Because I killed all their parents, so maybe he'd be mad at me. But 2, what if it's from the lineage of David? And they're from down in Bethlehem. So either way, because he was such a terrible person, he just knew whoever this baby was going to come try and take the kingdom back. He'd only been in command about 5 years when this happened. All right? So that kind of brings us up to where Jesus is born. All right? And Jesus is born under King Herod's rule. King Herod was from where? You can just say it. Edom, yeah. He was from Edom. And he was called Herod the what? The Great. Herod the Great. You know why he was called Herod the Great? Because he built some fantastic architecture. I've been to Israel and I've seen some of the stuff he built, and it is amazing. He was really, really incredible at building stuff. And it was actually the Romans that called him Herod the Great because I think they wanted to pump him up a little bit. So what ends up happening, I'm going to recap real quick. In 400 years between Malachi, between Malachi and Matthew, you have this period of just living, and then the Greeks come in and they take over, and they're just absolutely horrible. And they do this process called what? Do y'all remember? You can just say it. Hellenization. That's where they make everybody look like the Greeks. And what was the really big thing, my 3rd steps of prep, the horrible steps of prep, what was that big thing that they did? Why was it important on the spread of the gospel? They taught everybody to speak the same language. That's right. And now the Romans come in, and I'll just give you the 4th one because I doubt whoever's going to talk about this later is going to know my horrible steps of prep. The Romans come in with the 4th step. You know what they did? They made it where if you were a citizen of the Roman Empire, you could travel anywhere in the Roman Empire. So now all of a sudden, y'all remember a guy called the Apostle Paul? Y'all remember him? He wrote a bunch of stuff. You'll learn more about him in the coming weeks and months. He was able to travel all over the Roman Empire because he was a citizen of Rome. Under the Greeks, you couldn't do that. Under the Babylonians, you sure couldn't do that. You're just hauled to their capital. That's where you had to stay. Under the Assyrians, you got to travel a little ways, but boy, it wasn't fun. Right? So these 4 steps of spreading people out to plant seeds for the spread of the gospel later, protecting God's people during a terrible time, learning to speak the same language, and then eventually opening travel to where you could travel freely through this whole region, preps the world for the spread of the gospel of Christ. Sometimes really awful things happen. They happen around us. They happen to us sometimes. God's not wasting those things. There's some awful things happening in our country right now. If y'all hear your parents talking or your friends talking, if you see the news, there's some scary things happening. Just know that God's still in control. He's in control, and He may be preparing. In fact, you ought to be praying that even through these horrible things, God's preparing to spread His gospel to new people through these new roads. Can you imagine if you were hauled off into captivity? You'd be thinking, oh, this is awful. But if you can look back on it from here, you can say that was an amazing thing that helped us. You can imagine if the Greeks showed up and came in here and said, y'all can no longer go to church. You're not allowed to go to church. And not only that, you're not allowed to read Bibles. That'd be awful, wouldn't it? But it may be that God's preparing us for an amazing time. A time when the gospel's going to be spread like wildfire, and is going to take over the world. Yes, Ellen? Was he mad? Bad, yeah. Well, he was a Greek guy. He was not very nice, yeah. He was a pretty bad guy, but he was a really good warrior, apparently. Okay, so we've been talking about the Maccabees, right? That's the family. This is the important family that ruled this portion of history in Israel, okay? How many of you think you remember the 6 Maccabees? Any of you? Maybe some of you? If you don't remember, I'm going to run through them one more time, because after we do some praise and worship, it's probably going to be pretty important that you do remember them. The Big Mac, the Mac Daddy, if you will, his name's Mattathias. Mattathias Maccabee. He's the first Maccabee since Gideon. The oldest son, his name's John. And he's kind of simple and plain, just loves his family. And then you got Simon. He's not really good at anything, but he survives the longest, and it's his family that takes over. You got Judas. He was a beautiful man. Eleazar, he's a splendor of battle. And Jonathan, he's fast as a gazelle. All right? Those are the Maccabees. They were an incredible family. When you get older, I'll tell you a book to read about them. It's a really cool story. But for right now, we're going to have some praise and worship. And I think, as normal, we want you guys to be praying during this time. We want you to be coming to God with whatever your requests are. If you want to come and talk with Madison or Pastor Bob or me, we'd be happy to pray with you. We want for you to get into the practice of praying regularly, of going, and sometimes it's good to come up here. You want to kneel in front of the altar, you want to pray with your friends, you're welcome to do that. Certainly we would encourage you, but let's do some worshiping together.